This is Duke University.
Good afternoon. I am Neil Siegel, and I co-direct the program in public law here at Duke Law School. I am honored to introduce today's speaker, Lanny Breuer, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the United States Department of Justice. Mr. Breuer was unanimously confirmed to this position in April of 2009. As head of the Criminal Division, he oversees nearly 600 lawyers who prosecute federal criminal cases across the country and help to develop the criminal law. He is a national leader on a range of federal law enforcement priorities, including financial fraud, health care fraud, violence along the southwest border, and public corruption, the subject he will speak to us about today. Mr. Breuer has also been a leading voice on policy issues related to criminal law enforcement. These include the scope of prosecutors' discovery obligations in federal criminal cases and sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine offenses. For his work as Assistant AG, the National Law Journal recently named Mr. Breuer a visionary in the Washington, D.C. legal community, and he was recently ranked 8th on Ethisphere's list of the 100 most influential people in business ethics. Mr. Breuer brings to the Justice Department a rich variety and quite impressive array of legal experience in both public service and private practice. He began his legal career in 1985 as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where he prosecuted violent crime, including armed robbery and gang violence, white-collar crime, and other offenses. In 1989, he joined the law firm of Covington and Burling, where he worked until 1997, at which time he joined the White House counsel's office as special counsel to President Clinton. As special counsel, Mr. Breuer assisted in defending President Clinton in his Senate impeachment trial. Mr. Breuer returned to Covington in 1999 as co-chair of the White Collar Defense and Investigations Practice Group, where he specialized in white-collar criminal defense and complex civil litigation and represented individuals and corporations in matters involving high-stakes legal risks. Mr. Breuer has been recognized as a leading litigator by numerous publications, including the American Lawyers 45, Under 45, Chambers USA, The Best Lawyers in America, and my personal favorite, The Washingtonian's Big Guns. He is a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a member of the American Law Institute. I also want to introduce, in addition to Mr. Breuer, a Duke Law graduate of 2001, Amy Pope, who is his Deputy Chief of Staff. Mr. Breuer, welcome to Duke.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I think that introduction proves that if you're old enough, you do a lot of different things. And so it's sad when I think of the 45 under 45, how long ago it was that I qualified for that. I really wanted to be very informal with all of you today and just sort of speak from the heart and really leave a lot of time for questions later on. Amy Pope, who as the professor said, is my Deputy Chief of Staff, went to Duke and really loved it and asked me to come. I've had the privilege of working with Sarah Beal on the Criminal Rules Committee, and your esteemed Professor Buell used to be my associate. So once again, you see what that means for my age. So I've done a lot of different things in my career, and I thought I would give you sort of a little sense just of how I got to where I am now, for whatever relevance that is to all of you. So I grew up in New York City, which I think actually matters because I, to some degree, believe that no matter where you go to school or what you do, a little of your life's interest comes from your background, and I'm a New Yorker through and through and have been that even though I left New York a long time ago. I love being a lawyer. I love being a lawyer at a time when I think not everybody does. And so for me, the reason I've loved being a lawyer since 1985 is because I've always tried to find different things in my career that interested me. So I began my career in the Manhattan DA's office because I was a New York City kid. I was very interested in working in the DA's office. In fact, I wanted to do it right out of law school. I didn't want to go to a firm. And for 4 years, really when crime was at its height in New York, I was there. I'd like to think the crime rate went down because I was in the DA's office, but the crime rate went down about 15 years later. But I practiced in Manhattan, and I prosecuted from the most rudimentary cases. It started out, robberies and muggings, all the way to gang cases. I finally did a double homicide case, but it really gave me a sense of another side of New York. I'd grown up in Queens, and I really loved it. I loved trying cases. And then my wife, who's a lawyer as well, and I decided to, on a lark, to move to Washington, D.C. And ironically, if this is of any interest, we moved to Washington, D.C. because I naively thought that if I went to a law firm, knowing all of my interests, I probably would hate a law firm. And so I wanted to go to the city that I thought had the most sort of public interest related jobs. And so I went to this law firm, Covington and Burling. And if you look back at it, out of my 25 or 26 years of practice, I probably spent about 16 or 17 of those years at Covington. So one of my themes is it's very hard to predict what you're going to do or what you're going to like. And before I talk more about the Justice Department, even at Covington, when I was at a law firm and I worked on big cases, which I actually didn't mind, I always had a very active pro bono docket. It may have meant that I worked harder, but that was for me a very important part of my time in the private sector. So one of my themes to all of you is whatever you decide to do, it's really, really important at every stage to find out what you really enjoy doing. That's why I went to the DA's office. I went to a law firm, not necessarily because I thought it was what I'd enjoy, but I decided at some point in my life I should have a little bit of money. And so I decided I'd try to pay off a few debts. In fact, the only good advice my older brother ever gave me was when I was initially deciding whether to go to the DA's office or not. My brother, only good advice he ever gave me, said, Lan, you've never had any money in your life, so you won't know what you're missing. So after being at Covington and Burling, which is where I was with Professor Buell, I had actually, in 1993, when everybody else in the world in Washington was becoming a special assistant to President Clinton, because they had had the foresight to support President Clinton when he was running. I, of course, did not. I was positive that a Massachusetts politician by the name of Zongas was going to be the nominee, and so I stayed at Covington when everybody else left. But what I did do, and was an incredibly interesting experience, was in the beginning of the Clinton administration, I ended up suing the Clinton administration on behalf of the first openly gay Marine in the United States. And I represented him in the discharge proceedings at Camp Lejeune. I represented him in the district court where we prevailed. I represented him at the Court of Appeals, and we were very successful. And the reason I tell that story is that is how I came to be known to the people in the Clinton administration. It was because I sued them. And in 1997, I kid you not, in 1997 or end of 96, at the end of the first term, the beginning of the second, when they were looking for a new counsel to be in charge of the various investigations of the Clinton administration, the congressional investigations. At the time, they were called campaign finance investigations. There were investigations into President Clinton's raising of money in his run, for his second term against Senator Dole. The Department of Justice had an investigation. Congress had an investigation. Ken Starr's investigations were going on, and I was fortunate enough to be chosen to lead those teams. And then ultimately, as Professor Siegel said, I ended up being one of the 6 lawyers to represent the president during the impeachment. And obviously, from a life's experience and of a reasonably young lawyer, I mean, old for you guys, but young compared to what I am now, it was a great, great experience. And then after that, I went back to my law firm for 10 years. And in those 10 years, I, for the most part, did large white-collar cases, pretty much the ones you would read about, representing institutions and representing executives, running a pretty big group of lawyers at my firm and being involved in lots of related activities. And luckily enough, when President Obama got elected and they were trying to figure out who should be the AG of the criminal division, because of some of the things I did and because some of the people, I guess, who had worked with me, I was fortunate enough to get that job. And so just at my 50th birthday, I became the AAG of the Criminal Division, and it's absolutely the privilege of my professional career, and it's basically my professional dream come true. It is an extraordinary job because of the breadth of the work that our division does, because of the caliber of the lawyers with whom I get to work, the partnerships I get to have with the U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, and because the job is one component litigation, one component policy, one bit I get to talk to cool law students like all of you, and it's a great, great job. And so one of the things that I suggest to all of you as you think about your careers, you can do many different things in your careers, and I hope as law students you all don't think you only have one path. And maybe during the Q&A, if that's of any interest, I'd be delighted to talk to you more about it. But the criminal division is organized in a number of sections, and really, for the most part, the array of crimes that you think about are, for the most part, the array of crimes we get involved in. We deal with organized crime and gangs, and I'm exceedingly proud that we've reorganized that. I got Congress to let me merge those two sections into a large violent crime section, and we have had, over the last couple of years, the largest organized crime takedown in the history of the country. So even when people thought that folks like Tony Soprano were gone, we literally announced the largest takedown of the 5 traditional families in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Rhode Island, in a massive series of arrests. We've also had, for instance, in that group, the largest takedown of Eurasian organized crime. We took down an organization in LA called Armenian Power, and that was a group that had literally been preying upon Armenian Americans for the better part of a half a century. You heard me right, a half a century. It started out as a gang, and it had become more and more sophisticated. It was involved in cybercrime, IP crime, violent crime, and we took them down in a very comprehensive way. We've also really spent a lot of time dealing with gangs, and that's an enormously important issue to me because I grew up in a very working class neighborhood in Queens, and my parents were not born in the United States, and so the only benefit I had was that I could go to public schools and do as well as I could. And more in neighborhoods all over America today, kids can't do that because of gangs. Their moms are scared to send them to school, or they go to school and they have to be forced into gangs. And so we've tried in a pretty comprehensive way to take down gangs around the country. In Maryland, we took down the leadership of the Latin Kings gang. And I'm not naive to think when we do it, that doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist, but it's a blow. In California, we've just had 2 major trials in a row, victories against MS-13, where in San Francisco and the surrounding area, we took down those gangs. In Texas, in Tennessee, and in between, we've been doing a lot of that. And so my point in saying it is we spend a lot of time on violent crime, and yes, the federal government gets very involved in violent crime. I also was fortunate enough to talk about, by the way, I will finally get to the topic that the professor said I would talk about, but get used to me. You know, I was fortunate enough to talk about crack cocaine, and that was a huge issue because in America, for decades, there's been a huge debate about what had been the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. And the same quantity of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine resulted in a 100 times greater sentence. And what that really meant was when I was a prosecutor in the mid and late 80s, there was a crack epidemic. In New York, we had huge, ruthless battles between competing drug gangs who were fighting over blocks where they could sell crack. But what happened, and so there was a sense back then that crack was worse than powder cocaine. But of course, science and studies later proved that crack is no different than powder cocaine, right? It's like water and ice. But yet our sentencing guidelines were treating them dramatically differently. And the very tragic result of that was that African American males who tended more to deal in crack cocaine as opposed to Caucasians and others who tended to deal more in powder cocaine, were going to jail for stunningly long periods of time, and certainly stunningly long when compared to their contemporaries who were dealing with powder cocaine. And for decades, mothers and others were trying to coalesce groups to try to get the federal government to say that it had to change. And I was fortunate enough that because President Obama had talked about this issue when he ran, the Attorney General felt strongly about this issue, that in my first couple of weeks I testified in front of Congress, and it was an enormous moment that the Department of Justice said, this has got to change. And there were literally, and that's why my job's so powerful, there were these mothers and others weeping in the hearing room as I did it. I was just fortunate enough to get to do it. But we deal with all those kinds of issues. We deal with cybercrime. I don't know how many of you heard about the Mega Upload matter that we just took down, Mega Upload, but Mega in general. I didn't know about it. Stunningly, of all the things I have done in the last 3 years, the thing that my kid most cared about was that I took down Mega. I think it affected his day. So there are a lot of, very cutting edge issues with respect to cyber and IP. Obviously, one of the tragic results of the internet is the prevalence of child pornography and child exploitation. It's absolutely exploded as a result of the ease with which you can get these kinds of materials. And so we have a child exploitation section, an international affairs section. There's a huge international affairs area. So one of my points is at DOJ and in the criminal division, like the U.S. Attorney's offices, there's no limit to what you can do. There's no limit to how you can use your skill set. And it's something I hope you all think about. So one of the issues that was very important to me was not only that we were going to attract the very best lawyers, not only were we going to brand the criminal division, but we were going to be thematic about the kinds of things we did. We weren't just going to be disjointed. And so one of my goals was to deal with the issue of corruption, because I think corruption is insidious. You all, as bright law students at Duke Law School, take the rule of law for granted. There are a set of rules, there are a set of laws, you follow them. And if you don't follow them, there are consequences. You also, to some degree, take for granted more than you think the role of lawyers in a society, the role of lawyers in fighting for people's liberties and their rights. A few months ago, I was in Bucharest. I was in Romania, because Romania is an enormous place where we deal with organized crime, where we deal with cybercrime, IP crime. And I was there to speak, and I knew the ambassador well. And I got actually to speak, believe it or not, at the University of Bucharest Law School. I'm sure a lot of you were weighing Duke or Bucharest. And so the ones who went to Bucharest, I spoke with them. And what the ambassador told me to do, and it was really amazing, was he said, there is zero tradition, zero, of lawyers playing leadership roles in Romania in fighting for people's liberties, fighting corruption. They don't think of it. They don't think that that's the role of a lawyer. They just sort of accept that corruption is endemic. They sort of accept that the powerful will remain powerful. And they just sort of accept that their only lot in life as young lawyers is maybe to try to get a job. And so my speech was a call to arms. It was a pretty long talk to them about that their future was in their hands. Their country's future as young people was in their hands, and that some of them needed to try to be leaders in that. And you take that for granted, but I hope you think hard about it. So the way we in the criminal division deal with corruption is really threefold. The first part is pretty obvious. I got 600 prosecutors, right? There's 600 roughly prosecutors, and what we do is we prosecute. We put people in jail when they deserve to be put in jail. And so one of the ways we deal with corruption is by the cases we bring. We do that through our public integrity section, and we do that through our fraud section. I won't take this. So in our public integrity section, which is a group that of lawyers that just deal with public officials and the like who abuse their authority, We prosecute people and investigate people all over the country, from the local, councilman all the way up to senators and the like. Without commenting on the case, it's of course the public integrity section that indicted Senator Edwards and everywhere in between. And obviously, many of the things we do can be controversial. Much of it can be. So we prosecute and investigate councilmen, senators, congressmen, governors. We have a big case starting in Alabama right now, the largest corruption case in the history of Alabama, where a number of the members of the state legislature have been indicted for what the government alleges is their bribes in the millions of dollars with respect to permitting gaming in Alabama. And the Abramoff case and the legacy of those cases, and really every week somewhere we announce it. In the fraud section, we do the same internationally with respect to something called the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that's become an issue of great discussion, both in Congress. I just met with a group of senators about it. The Chamber of Commerce, it's become an issue of great debate. But really since the 70s and the time of the Nixon administration, the United States has tried to outlaw Americans or others doing business who pay bribes to foreign officials in order to get business. And this has been a huge arc. And you see in a lot of statutes that it takes a while for them really to be used. So in the early part of the FCPA, it was rarely used. Then occasionally cases were brought against corporations. And now, certainly in the last 3 years since I've been the AAG, you'll see that both with respect to corporations, domestic and international, and actually individuals and officers and executives, we're bringing a lot of cases. And I do believe that you have to hold individuals accountable. It's not enough to just indict a corporation or to get a penalty from a corporation. If you want to deter conduct, you have to hold the executives who knowingly were involved in this kind of activity responsible. And so the FCPA is a large area. And so between the two, you see a lot of activity with respect to corruption. The reason I think it's so important is I think if you live in a society where corruption is endemic or permitted, it defeats everyone. You know, if you look now today, in my view, in the last year of the Arab Spring and what's occurred in Northern Africa and the Middle East, look how the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, when that poor fellow, Bouazizi, set himself ablaze. There are many reasons I'm sure he did it, and I'm sure there are many reasons that the Arab Spring commenced. But to my mind, without question, one of those reasons is corruption. Here was a young man who's a seller, I think, of fruit, and he was dealing with petty corruption, right? He was dealing with the local inspector who was shaking him down and who humiliated him. But it was corruption. And in those societies, what it hit, the trigger it hit in my mind, was that you had a generation, certainly your generation of young people, but even those older, who felt that no matter what they did, it was hard to succeed. The way you succeeded was if you were born powerful or if you were corrupt. But if you worked hard in a society where you had no ability to better yourself, that, of course, that's a terrible place to be. And I think that sort of fighting of corruption is one of really, I think, one of the great exports of the United States. And I see it. You know, in the last year, Russia has signed an anti-bribery statute, and we know corruption is rife in Russia. I gave a speech in Moscow, and I met with groups, and the Wall Street Journal made fun of me for speaking about corruption in Russia. And my view is that's exactly where you need to be. And there were groups with whom I met and activists with whom I met who talked very, very wantingly, were very excited about the notion that we would put more pressure on Russia. Russia now wants to become a member of the OECD. That's an organization, an international organization, and one of the ways they can join is based on what their anti-corruption efforts are. China is doing it. England just passed a very strong anti-bribery statute. And so you really see that, I think, by certain countries acting in the way we do and really having a strong hand, that you end up can affect the actions of international players. I think that's important because I think as we talk about jobs being lost in the United States, as we talk about our economy, one of the benefits I think we want is we want an even playing field. I don't want any company, and certainly not an American company, losing out on a contract because of corruption, so we've taken it hard. Besides prosecuting, the other thing we do is we have training all over the world. We have what's called rule of law training. And so there are incredibly cool jobs out of the Department of Justice. So I have lawyers right now all over the world. I have lawyers who have just gone to Libya. I have lawyers in Egypt. I have lawyers in Romania. And one of the major things they do is they train their counterparts. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Mexico dealing with the cartels. It's been an enormous undertaking of mine and of our team. And I probably have at any one time probably 8 lawyers full-time, and at any other time lots of lawyers come in. Training prosecutors, what does it mean to prosecute? Training investigators, how do you investigate? How do you talk to witnesses? We're creating for the Mexicans a witness security program that the criminal division is doing. We got legislation passed in Mexico because if you're going to try in Mexico Mexican cartel figures, you have to do something to protect the witnesses and their families. And so it seems pretty basic, but our friends in Mexico didn't have that. We're doing that. Well, it's remarkable. What's remarkable, it's people not a lot older than you who are really doing it. They're the people doing it. That's pretty real. They're living in Mexico, they're living in Bucharest, they're living in Moscow, and they're dealing with their counterparts, and they're dealing with government officials, and it's very tangible and it's very real. Helping legislators change the laws in their country. And so as you're thinking about opportunities, that's a very real opportunity, and we put a lot of people to work. I work very closely with the State Department. In fact, while I was waiting here, I was emailing them about a program. We have something called the Civilian Response Corps, of a group of prosecutors who work now in our division, but at any moment they can be called anywhere around the world for civilian response when there is some sort of an emergency. So that's the second way we deal with corruption, the training, the working, the partnerships. And then the third is brand new. I call it the Kleptocracy Initiative, and it's brand new, and I've recruited 6 stunningly talented prosecutors from around the country, and that is, in a civil context, we're filing suit against corrupt foreign leaders, who we allege are corrupt foreign leaders when they spend their corrupt proceeds in the United States. We try to seize them, and then we try to find a vehicle, if we succeed, to return the money. So we filed a pretty newsworthy case against the Minister of Agriculture, a fellow by the name of Obiang from Equatorial Guinea. He is the son of the president. He earned, as the Minister of Agriculture, about $40,000 to $50,000 a year. And we seized his $33 million mansion in Malibu. We're trying to seize his $38 million Gulfstream jet. We're trying to seize his Michael Jackson memorabilia, including his glove. And I really didn't sue him just because he likes Michael Jackson. And so that's another initiative. And obviously that's going to be hard fought, right? If you bring suit against the Minister of Agriculture who's worth $100 million, you know he's going to have some of the finest law firms in the country represent him. You know these cases are going to be hard fought and long, but I think it's important. And then if we succeed, we'll have to figure out a way to return the money. So we prosecute, we train, and now we try to recover money. And so when somebody asks me, why do I love my job? I get to recruit incredibly smart, talented people. So my Deputy Chief of Staff, Amy Pope, who's a Duke Law grad, came to D.O.J. through the honors program and has had an extraordinary career ever since, both in D.O.J. and on the Hill. I get lawyers from prominent law firms, great law firms. When I came on board, I was able to convince partners from all over the country to leave their law firms to come serve with me. Some of them are now my chiefs. They're folks around my age. I've been able to recruit AUSAs from a number of offices all over the country, including from Professor Buell's old office in the Eastern District of New York. So I guess what I'd say to all of you is the department's commitment to fighting corruption is great. It's a privilege for me to work with my dear friend, the Attorney General Eric Holder, who's a remarkable public servant. It's an incredible privilege for me to be a part of the Obama administration. But more relevant to all of you, I've been a local prosecutor. I've been a big firm associate and partner. I've been in the White House during the most turbulent times through the impeachment, and now I get to do this. I have no clue what I'll do next, but I would say to all of you, if you take a step back and you take a deep breath, being a lawyer is a terrific job. And with that, Professor, if it works out, I'm sort of done talking, but I'd love to answer any questions people have. Thanks so much.
We've got about 30 minutes. Questions for Mr. Breuer?
Yeah, I had a question. When you were talking about the increased enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the rule of law initiatives in other countries, is that a dangerous job for the employees who do that, or what kind of protections do you have?
So that's a great question, and it really depends, right? So not to be silly, but if you're my attaché in Paris, your biggest risk is your cholesterol. If you are one of my folks in Mexico City, yes. So to give you an idea of the kinds of things I fight about, I had to fight harder than you can imagine to get my people, armor-plated cars so that they could drive and get them housing nearby. And it's something we think about. You know, we have people still in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so what I'd say to you, which is fascinating, is I meet every one of our resident legal advisors. So that's called an RLA. So let's say you're a prosecutor in North Carolina, and we post, and you've been in the office for 8 years, and you really want to see the world, and you've been prosecuting certain kinds of cases, and you'd love to train people, young prosecutors in another country about evidence collection and teach judges how to call it fairly. It's exhilarating. There can be challenges depending on where you go, but when these people come back, I always say it the same way, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're single, whether they're married, whether they're tall or short, doesn't matter. I'm not making it up. I always say to them, so, what did you think? And with almost no exceptions, now of late in Iraq, it's a little different as the military is leaving, and obviously right now the security issues in Iraq are a little dicey, but for a moment, putting that aside, every one of these people, for the most part, has loved it. And when I ask them why, they say it differently, but the bottom line answer is because I really felt I made a difference. And so what that experience gives you is in a very limited time, in a short period of time, a year or 2 years, you can have a life's experience that will be with you forever. Now, some people, like one of Professor Buell's colleagues from the Eastern District of New York, a fellow named Tom Firestone, is a fluent Russian speaker, and we sent him years ago to Moscow. And he's probably now, in his early 40s, but he's been there 12 years. I kid you not, Tom Firestone is one of the most influential Americans in Moscow. He has made more change in that country, I would bet, than most of our ambassadors ever could. He loves it. He's been involved in helping the Russians create legislation. He pushes them as aggressively as you can. And so he just continues to stay there because he's created a niche that's amazing. And there are people like that as well. So it's all different things, but it's an enormously important undertaking, and candidly, something I knew nothing about before I became AAG. And that, to me, one of the great jobs is, if you talk to me about white-collar cases, I knew a fair bit about it. But when I left my law firm and became AAG, I knew very little about all of the training that we do around the world. And in my mind, it's a huge part. It should be a significant part of America's foreign policy, and my friends at the State Department know I think that, so I encourage you to think about it. Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the criminal division and the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Absolutely. So when you're an AUSA in an office, and until probably fairly recently, you wouldn't have thought about the criminal division at all. I mean, the criminal division played certain roles, but basically it didn't affect your life. So the criminal division, and I've tried to change it, has a lot of sections. Some sections just prosecute: the fraud section, the public integrity section, the organized crime section, child exploitation, our computer crime section. And other sections provide a service to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So if you're Sam Buell and you're a star prosecutor and you have an international case and you want to get evidence abroad, you have to get that evidence more often than not through something called an MLAT, a Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. And anything when you're dealing internationally, you have to go through the Office of International Affairs. And we have a very large Office of International Affairs of prosecutors who are expert in that. And by the way, in my in life, how it works, some of our people at OIA have only been in OIA because they love international affairs and they're experts in regions of the country. Others were line prosecutors in U.S. attorneys' offices or the criminal division, and maybe they don't want to try cases now, or maybe they themselves don't want to travel so much, so they've decided to go to OIA. But OIA deals with extradition. So one of our biggest vehicles, for instance, in fighting Mexican cartels, which, as I said a few moments ago, has been a big issue of mine, is that the Mexican, without being quoted too much, the Mexican criminal justice system has challenges, and they're moving to a system more like ours. And one of our arguments has been that we should take some of the worst cartel members, we should extradite them to the United States, and we should prosecute them here. And we've done that. The Eastern District of New York has been very successful. The Southern District of New York is successful. The Criminal Division, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. So if you, there are things we do for you, or if you want to bring what's called a RICO case, a racketeering case, you can't do that if you're a prosecutor unless you get my racketeering section, my organized crime section, to approve it, or a death penalty case. So I have a capital case unit. If there's a federal case that calls for the death penalty, there's a very long review before the United States would ever authorize seeking the death penalty, and the Attorney General has to sign off on each one of those. But that would be another section where you have to go for approval. And if you want to have a wiretap, if you want to go on someone's telephone line, before as a AUSA you can go to a federal judge and submit papers and try to get that, you first have to get permission from my criminal division, and we have a team to look at that through the Office of Employment Operations. Now, with respect to the rest, the prosecutors, there used to be, in my mind, more of a competition between U.S. attorneys' offices and the criminal division. It was very important to me to try to build partnerships as best as we could. And so now what we really do, Sarah, is we do partner up. Sometimes we do it alone, or in other times, because of either relationships I have or the fact that I have lots of AUSAs who've come to my division, and because sometimes you need more people. It's a time of fiscal austerity, so many offices need help, or frankly, because we have expertise. And so it's a system that works like that. And so in some offices we team up a lot, some offices we never team up, and sometimes we do it on our own. It used to be the concept was that the criminal division had only a special expertise, and that's what it did. That's true for certain kinds of cases, the FCPA being one. Every FCPA case has to be approved by the criminal division, by the fraud section, and in fact is almost always run by it. And others, it's because we have the relationship or we're teaming up. So that's sort of the relationship between the two. Sure.
Spoke a little bit about fiscal austerity. Can you talk a little bit about how budget constraints have affected your division in terms of both hiring and in the cases that you bring?
Right. So whenever I go to Congress, I'm always supposed to say that we're fine with what we have. So we're fine with what we have. Obviously, it affects us. We have to be, the way I do it is I wanted us to be much more thoughtful about what the kinds of cases are we're bringing. So when I started 3 years ago and you went to my fraud section, and you might have been at the fraud section for 20 years, and you might have, just like in private practice, had a relationship with somebody at the FTC, and you were really interested in these small scams, you might be doing those cases. And so I took a hard look and said, well, is that really the best use of one of our federal prosecutors in the fraud section? Should you, as bad as that is, that there's this small scam, should you be doing that, or should I have you be working on, a much larger kind of case? And so one of the ways we've dealt with that is we've been more ruthless and thoughtful about what kinds of cases we bring and what kind of cases we don't bring. The second thing that I did, and it's just management, is I became AAG a week after the Ted Stevens case. I don't know if you all know the Ted Stevens case. It was the senator from Alaska. It was a debacle. The attorney general decided to dismiss the case. And by the way, I should say I've spent an enormous amount of time dealing with the issues of criminal discovery, both on the Criminal Rules Committee with Professor Beal and others, but by any account, the Department of Justice, what we've done in the last 3 years in training prosecutors is unprecedented. But one of the things I did as a result as I was rebuilding the section was in the public integrity section and others, which I had litigated against, there were just too many cases that were too old. They were just too old. And prosecutors were nurturing them and holding on to them. And so what I did was I was pretty ruthless. And actually my new chief, who came from the Eastern District of New York, a fellow named Jack Smith, who had a similar orientation to mine, is I had every single case in that section that was more than 18 months old. I wanted to hear about it, every single case. And there are legitimate reasons why a case should be more than a year and a half. But if there wasn't, in my opinion, a good reason, we just stopped. You might have won the lottery. If we thought we had enough of a case to indict you, we did. Otherwise, my decision was we were moving on. As a result of that decision, in the history of the public integrity section, typically my 20 or so lawyers in that section in an average year would try 2 to 3 cases. Last year we tried 17, 15 convictions, 1 acquittal, 1 hung. And so that was one of the things I did. You don't get to hold on to the case until it's perfect. You've got to make some real decisions because I don't have the luxury to do that. And so that was another issue we're doing. And we continue very much to figure out other ways of saving money. Part is the partnerships with the U.S. Attorney's Office. If I only have to put 1 prosecutor on a case because the U.S. Attorney in California is going to put on 1, that may be a lot more efficient. And so those are the realities. But there's also no question that it's a challenge, right? A lot of the FBI's resources, as they must go to counterterrorism. By doing that, they don't go to traditional crime. The criminal division, we have to do more with less, and that's just unfortunately going to continue to be the issue. And the other issue you find is, of course, our local district attorneys are feeling terrific stress, right? Our states aren't doing well, our counties aren't doing well, and so more and more DAs are asking the federal government to come in and help. And so, we're trying to figure out ingenious ways of task forces combining state and local, which is something we're trying to do. But those are some of the things we've been doing. Sure.
When you're filing an MLAW in a cyber case, because cyber evidence can be sanitized very quickly, how are you adapting to deal with this newer, technology and having a law keep up with it?
Beats me. So I got really, really smart people, right? I mean, really, I'm not joking, and Amy can say, I mean, if you just wanted to have a pure IQ test, I'll take my CSIPS lawyers and put them against anyone. So what we really have is we have a cyber lab within my CSIPS unit. So while I have a bunch of prosecutors, I literally have an independent lab that and it is staffed by these just computer wizards who are not lawyers. Most seriously, of the CSIPS lawyers are people who had an affinity for computers since they were little. And so whether it's the mega upload case, or this is public too, you know, we took down a major botnet about 3 months ago. I mean, there are a lot of Fourth Amendment issues that we had to deal with. We just continue to deal with the FBI and others as best we can. And so when I say it beats me, I'm being serious. It is so beyond my understanding, but I can tell you that when we just did this other case, I probably had 100 hours of calls, which is a lot when you're the AAG, in anticipation of getting ready, trying to identify all these kinds of issues. The only other plug I'd say to all of you who like computers is, not only is this cool work, but those CSIPS people, when they won, if you now go, like the Facebook IPO today, CSIPS, those people go to the coolest companies in the world. So if you look at every high-tech company and how they staff their leading lawyers, more often than not, those 30 or so computer crime lawyers that I have in my criminal division, some stay forever and some become gazillionaires. So, you know, it's just something to think about.
I just wanted to follow up on the question earlier. And
Not the one on the computer,
no,
please.
I know, even less, I'm sure. About being selective about the cases that you're bringing because of budget constraints. The third newer option that you mentioned about bringing cases where foreign dirty money basically is being spent in the United States and trying to seize it and
Right.
the Jackson Glove. What is the rationale behind?
Because I think, you know, if we're going to be prosecuting corrupt officials, and if we're going to be saying to corporations, we hold you liable if you're trying to bribe a local Russian official so you can get a deal, there is just something to me viscerally unacceptable about allowing a corrupt official to buy a huge home in Malibu and to parade around, and that we know, or we believe we know, that his ability to buy that is through that. I think it's a corrupting influence. I don't think the United States should be a place that permits money laundering. So I don't think we should permit our banking system to be used for those around the world who are stealing from their people. And in the same way that I don't want Mexican cartel figures buying property in the United States based on the savagery of what they do. I don't want an alleged corrupt figure. I mean, this is litigated, so let's not talk about that case, but I don't want another alleged figure. And so if we think we have the case, I think we have the obligation to do it. Now, I'm the first to admit it's a new initiative. I've got 5 people doing it. So I don't pretend, nor will I say that I'm curing the system. But you got to start somewhere. In the same way that the FCPA began as a statute that was somewhat dormant, and now it's obviously a very powerful tool. I believe you're going to see in the next 20 years that this initiative that we started also will be. And so that's really, it's sort of what it represents. And frankly, when I go around the world and I'm talking to my counterparts, and I do that a lot, I should say, one of the other big parts of my job is both abroad and in the United States. I deal with my contemporaries. Yesterday I had a long meeting. I had a meeting with the Israeli Minister of Justice, and the week before I had a meeting with the Saudi Arabian Minister of Justice. And so there are a lot of these discussions, and my view is my only credibility is based on what we're doing. And if I don't want there to be this level of corruption, I've got to say that in any way we can, we ought to use our tools. So that's how that started. Sure.
So for me, I feel like a kind of an elephant in the room on the issue of public corruption is the financial crisis in 2008, and particularly the subprime mortgages and stuff like that. And I guess I'm wondering, and I think a lot of Americans wonder why there hasn't been
Sure.
more, aggressive actions.
Well, okay, so that's great, and you can all see me on 60 Minutes where I talked about it. And it's a great question, and it's a legitimate. So let me say a few things. So first of all, prosecutors by nature, and frankly, I by nature, are fairly aggressive, confident people. And I know, and my colleagues know, that if we can bring one of these cases, besides it's the right thing to do, it's not exactly a bad career move. So I just want to be clear on the motive. But these are very difficult cases. And they're difficult for a lot of reasons. First of all, the fact that a lot of these transactions may seem to us, may actually seem to me, to represent excessive greed, really terribly excessive greed, and in fact, excessive risk-taking, terribly excessive risk-taking. Greed and risk-taking are not against the criminal laws. And in an environment where regulators either permitted or didn't watch carefully, or in an environment where very complicated structures were created under the eyes of the most sophisticated law firms in the country, where the party and the counterparty tended to be both very risk-taking, both willing to take great risk, and both perhaps exhibiting what you would think to be excessive greed. But they went in as equivalent counterparties, understanding what they did or didn't know. So when you put law firms in the mix, when you put the sophistication of the parties in the mix, when you look at the disclosure statements, when you look at the laws and compare it to the practices, these cases become very, very difficult. Now, as the Attorney General said, and as the President announced in his State of the Union address, we've just created a residential mortgage-backed securities working group. It's combining the criminal division, the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country, and the SEC and the states. I'm one of the co-chairs. The Attorney General from New York is one. The head of enforcement at the SEC is one. So people are spending a lot of time, and we've spent a lot of time on it, and cases take a long time. But outrage ain't enough for my criminal division. It's just not. And so I promise nothing other than people are going to continue to work hard. We've been aggressive, and that's what I try to say. The same group of lawyers that have had the largest organized crime takedown in history, the largest Medicare fraud takedowns in history, the first precedent-setting takedowns on botnets, the largest IP infringing takedown in history. Right now I'm trying a case against Alan Stanford in Houston. We did the Lee Barkas case where he's in jail for 50 years for a $3 billion fraud. It's not like, those synapses are turned off when we're looking at this. But, we call it the way we see it. And sometimes, in areas like the FCPA, I get accused and criticized for being too aggressive. In other areas like the RMBS area that you're talking about, I get criticized by the New York Times just the other day and others for being not aggressive enough. I do it the same way in all of it. And all I can do is we look at it hard, we look at the law. If we can prove a crime's been committed, we're going to bring the case. But if we can't, as despicable as the conduct is, I just can't bring the case, and I won't bring the case. And I don't have a better answer than that. I'm being totally straight with you.
Can you describe a little bit about the cooperative or grudging relationships between D.O.J. and either domestic agencies or foreign agencies for conducting a FCPA investigation?
So that's a great question. It's transformed a lot. So I think that makes my case, not completely, but if you now look, the Siemens case, which many of you may know about, was a very big case. It was a precedent-setting case, how big it was. But when I became AAG, there was a big issue that I noticed, which was we'd gone after the company, but none of the executives had been prosecuted. And a couple of months ago, we announced the indictment of, I think it was 7 Siemens executives. So Siemens is a great example of a great collaborative relationship with the Germans. And also going to your question, because of this evolution, one of the ways we're able to deal with constraints is whereas before we, the Department of Justice, would have taken the entire case. We now may be in a place where I can deal with our German counterparts and say, look, this is the part that makes sense for us to take, but maybe that's the part that you should take. Now, it may depend, do they have the similar kind of laws? Do they have what we consider to be an adequate penalty? So we may or may not do it. So some of our partners have really matured and are really far along and are prosecuting themselves. Others of our partners aren't doing that, but they've become pretty good about investigating. So, you know, I mentioned before, the Romanians are excellent partners of ours. They may not have quite the system, and you may not assume that they would, but they've been excellent partners in a whole series of investigations. And then other countries, for different motives or different reasons, might be less strong, you know. And so it's like everything in life. I can't generalize other than it's trending in the right way. It's trending in the right way. And then when you talk about our relationships, it also can depend on what is the kind of crime. So certain crimes, some countries totally work with us, and others may be in the corruption area. Maybe if we're looking at one of their more powerful people, we get more stymied. And if I'm nothing else, I'm a realist, and so we really, you know, it's very iterative. But there's no question that as we've done more in the FCPA, as we've spoken more about it, as we've been more aggressive, as international bodies have become more interested in it, like the OECD, the United Nations. I spoke at the United Nations about corruption. I gave a long speech on exactly what I talked to you about, our comprehensive approach. There's no question that more and more countries are doing it. It's not a panacea, but it's definitely going in that right direction. And there's no question that in general cooperation was much greater. I always say when I was in the DA's office, I thought something was international, you know, if I had to go to Brooklyn. You know, now it's truly an international undertaking, and so that's what we're doing.
So, Lenny, I was going to make sure you didn't get away without a hardball question.
Good.
No, one of the students took care of that, so but I'll ask you another softball. So I think it's a softball, which is I think the students might be interested to hear how do you deal with the fact that when you were in private practice, you were one of the attorneys representing Roger Clemens when he was called before the congressional committee, and now the Justice Department is getting ready to retry him for perjury. And obviously there's a mechanical answer to that question that might be informative for people, but also just how do you think about that?
Well, that's a great question. It's a really great question. Look, first, before I talk about Clemens, and I will, I'll take it directly. Amy's too far away to kick me, so I have a little bit of ability here. Look, if you've had a practice like I have had, you're going to have conflicts, right? I was lucky in my private practice, so I represented a lot of companies and a lot of individuals. I represented national security advisors and famous athletes and billionaire businessmen and a whole bunch of people, so there was going to be some level of that. In fact, not that you'd know it, but you know, while I've been AAG, I had defended the Lieutenant Governor of American Samoa. When I got this job, I gave it to one of my younger partners. The very prosecutors who report to me were prosecuting my former client. And look, at the end of the day, you know, you have some emotions. You know, some people say that when they represent clients that they don't have emotions. I always did, you know, particularly with individuals, and you grow fond. And I'm not bashful to say, even though I'm a lifelong Mets fan, I like Roger Clemens. I like him a lot. I mean, and so obviously the mechanical answer is I'm absolutely recused. I can have absolutely no part of that case, and nor do I. Obviously, I know every single person in that trial. I know every prosecutor. That's the U.S. Attorney's Office, by the way. It's not my criminal division, but I still know them. And so it's hard. You know, you see, and I think it's made me a better, and this has nothing to do with Clemens, it's made me be a better AAG. You know, I always say, I mean, Sam, you know this, when my associates became AUSAs, the last thing I would say to my associates was, remember, the world is in black and white, it's gray. You got to use judgment. People make mistakes. You got to figure it out. And I really believe that. I believe that in life itself. The world is gray. That doesn't mean people don't commit crimes, but you have to understand it. And there's no question that in my mind there was a series of cases that my division was handling that probably the federal government should not be handling, maybe because of resource issues, or maybe because they're just not in the scheme of what the federal government should be doing, in my mind at least, of such import. And so that's some of the calculus. So with Clemens, it's obviously, it's hard for me, right? Because I like the guy. I like him very much. And I don't wish my former client any ill will. But I also understand that the institution has to go forward. I mean, I'm not sure that if, I were emperor of the world, I would necessarily think that that's necessarily that this should have happened the way it did, but that's not for me because I didn't do that one. And so on a personal note, it's hard, just like it was hard when my former client was in trial and my prosecutors were prosecuting him. In that case, by the way, it was a hung jury, and they ultimately, didn't go forward. So it's just sort of the way it is, and it happens to me more than you'd think because I had a pretty big practice. So, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. Let me finish because I'm being pulled up. I think it's good to have people in the public life who've done different things, and so I'd encourage you all to do things. I was a better private lawyer because I'd been a prosecutor. I'm a better AAG because I had had an extensive private practice and because I'd been in the White House. And I think, that's what makes you better. It's those experiences, whether you're a young lawyer and you become an RLA and you spend a year abroad, whether you decide one day you want to go to Facebook or Google, but first you're going to go to the computer crimes and intellectual property section, or maybe you're a rich partner in New York and you decide at 50 you have enough money, so when Lanny Breuer calls you decide to go back in the government. All of those things, and they also make your life a lot better, right? It's just, it's a cool thing to do. So anyway, thanks everybody.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.